It gives me boundless joy to reintroduce our keynote speaker for our conference. We have, who really truly needs no introduction, especially since we introduced him yesterday. But unlike this time, especially for live stream audiences who are there, we received a message that it is approaching 2 a.m. in Paris, and yet people have stayed up into the night for this moment. Without any further ado, let me turn it over to Chuck Bigelow for Prediction is Difficult, especially about the future.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me back to where I have certainly had the most thrilling time of all in the 30 years I was sentenced as a college professor for the sins of my youth. The only thing that even comes close to my thrill and excitement at Stanford was when I spent a year teaching math and science to high school dropouts. But at Stanford, my job was to inculcate avid and dedicated students with the tricks of the trade and the knowledge that could help give them careers. Teaching high school dropouts, my job was mostly to keep them out of jail. So anyway, it's good to come back to Stanford, and I'm not going to go back to dropouts. They're beyond. So in October of 1982, Donald Knuth, he had invited me to come to Stanford to work on the digital typography program that his research had inspired. And he invited me and Chris Holmes, my studio partner then, and still, to dinner at his house. And there I had the great pleasure of meeting Wilhelm Bohr, the grandson of Niels Bohr, the Danish quantum physicist. And during the dinner or afterwards, I was able to ask Wilhelm Bohr various questions about anecdotes and things I'd heard about Niels Bohr. And one of them was, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. He said, oh yes, well, our family knows that. And there were several others. One was, some things are so serious you can only laugh about them. And so here I am again in the late fall, some 41 years later, and I wanted to honor Niels Bohr with this quote. We find nowhere that he actually wrote it, but it's been handed down in the oral tradition through his family and those who knew him. So, and prediction, I think I'll probably show you that it is difficult, even though I wish it weren't. Here are examples. On the upper left, we see a Renaissance woodcut showing how type can be constructed by compass and straight edge in a Euclidean constructive style. On the upper right, we see the work of the savants in France, working for the French king and Colbert, where they laid it out on a Cartesian coordinate system, which was, remember, a new invention by 1700 or 1695 when they did this, and that they still used arc and circles to define the types. And as it turns out, they were imaginative in several ways by the approach. In the lower right, we see bitmaps, a bitmap of a capital O, and this was, as Ferdinand Ulrich pointed out, one of the early phases of digital typography was the hand editing of bitmaps. And on the lower left is the partial deconstruction of a Bézier curve using the style used first by Adobe as a commercial system. So we have then at each stage an evolution sort of technology, but not just the machines and gizmos, but the ideas. There's you can see the node points on the Béziers, and then you see the geometric construction by the French mathematician de Casteljou. So what has digital type done? Well, in these years, since the A-Type I conference at Stanford, a lot has happened, as you know. One of them is that the digital approach allows us to create fonts much more inexpensively, to distribute them much faster and less expensively, but also to create them, especially variations. So for example, here on the, as we have a bunch of Lucida Sans types that we eventually, I think, made 18 weights. Now, almost nobody uses all those 18 weights, but they use the middle range and a few of the outliers. And this is an example where the technology has outstripped our ability to actually understand and cognize and perceive differences, because most People can tell the difference between normal and bold weight or normal and lightweight, but they can't tell the difference between all 18 of these. And we did an experiment once trying to find what's called the Weber fraction, instituted by a 19th century psychophysicist, where you want to say, if something weighs this much, how much heavier does it have to be before it feels heavier? Well, it's a common factor. So if it needs to be half again as heavy, then you do that. How much heavier do you go next? Half again as heavy as the first one. So it keeps going up and up. Here we did a slightly less clear gamut, but what we've lost is the ability to know what the psychophysical effect is of such variations. The same applies to widths and to other aspects of type. There are now, of course, many ways, multi-axis variable fonts, and there are very few methods of actually deciding what the fraction of increase should be for each of these. It may vary. Another thing we can do, and it is done now quite effectively, is look at the evolution of type. So in this slide, we start with the modern. It's easiest to do digital if somebody else has already done the hard work of reviving the historical type. So there are some deviations here depending on the reasons why it was revived, who revived it, what their aesthetic, what their sales methods were. But nevertheless, we can do this. The top letters are roughly a revival of Jensen's typeface, Roman type of 1470. It was a huge step because it was the first really successful transition from handwriting, humanist handwriting, to typefaces. After that, future typefaces didn't have to go back to handwriting, at least in Roman serif type. They could look at what had just come before or a ways before. And soon after Jensen's type, 25 years later, historically speaking, there was the types of Aldus, cut by Francesco Grifo. And people liked them, but Aldus never promoted them except as for his own printing company, his publishing company. But in 1530, it became the fashion of Paris. And so from 1530 to about 1545, this idea swept through Paris, the Italian style of Aldus. And so, and that trend, making it a little finer, a little sharper, a little more sophisticated, a little more geometric in form, lasted until the next one here. This is by Robert Grandjean, as revived by Matthew Carter, who's been mentioned here before. It's brighter, it's sharper, it's a little more contrast between thick and thin. Then we get to the Dutch old faces. This one is by Nicholas Kish, a Hungarian who studied punch cutting with in Holland, in Amsterdam, with, I have to remember his name in a minute, but anyway, he studied it, took it back to, what's that?
Dirk Voskens.
Yes, Dirk Vosken, yes, thank you. He took it back, and the type is, later, the matrices were sold to a German foundry, and where it became called Janssen, or Janssen as we say. And my own teacher, Jack Stoffaker, loved this typeface and had a huge collection of it. It was a marvelous work. And then we get to Baskerville. And as you may know, when Baskerville came out, the English savants even, scientists complained that it was sure to blind the reading population of England because of the high contrast and the sharpness of the serifs. Benjamin Franklin befriended Baskerville and tricked a English savant. He never gave his name, but I believe he was one of the Royal Society of Scientists, by the way that Franklin describes him. He comes to Franklin's shop, Franklin, well known as a scientist from America, wearing his coonskin cap and looking really very frontiers-like. And he said, well, have you heard of this Baskerville? It's sure to blind the population. Every part just claws at your eyes. And so Franklin ripped off the top of a specimen from William Caslon and took it to the guy and said, look, here's the latest from Baskerville. Tell me what's wrong with it. And the guy described all of these horrible effects on it. And Franklin wrote to Baskerville and said, well, I didn't have the heart to tell him that he was looking at Caslon that he'd been reading for the last 50 years. But not to be outdone by English fashion, the French, in this case Didot, created something even further down this row. And now it's really the ne plus ultra. You can't go farther than this in a serifed face. It's utterly geometric, not geometric, but upright. Everything is conditioned. It has a wonderful look. This is really almost from 1820, so it's really the perfect end. But you could, I think if we interpolated from between Jensen and Didot, we could find a sequence almost like this. You might have to tweak a few things to kind of get it to rationalize. But remember, these are all hand cut by artists and artisans who had their own little tweaks and quirks. Now, this is a quote from the American science fiction writer, William Gibson. And I think it felt wonderful at the time I was at Stanford. The future was already here at Stanford in 1983, but it just wasn't evenly distributed. And this was true as Ferdinand pointed out, that there was some places doing digital type and not others. And if we want to predict the future, we can try to extrapolate from what we saw in the past, but that's not always the perfect method. In fact, I think there is no perfect method. When you get to sans serif type, the evolution we saw for serif type breaks down entirely. And instead of a single, almost monotonic progression from one form to the next, each done incrementally with people only imitating what just came before, the sans serifs appeared in England, but they were only a handful of types among almost 500 weird variations that English punch cutters created in the 19th century for marketing and sales. But the English grotesque was adopted in Germany, where it served a functional purpose of using small sizes in a kind of a non-connotative form that was not the Fraktur that was then thought to be the right shape and the right forms. Above, we see the monotype, essentially imitation of a German grotesque, probably Ideal, which was an imitation of another grotesque. And then below that is Univers, Adrian Freudiger's marvelous neo-grotesque of 1957. So we found the grotesques early. They went out of fashion for a while and then came back into fashion in 1957. Here's the American Franklin Gothic by Morris Fuller Benton in the early 1900s. And I looked around, I was not able to find a modern Gothic, as it was called. There were older Gothics that were not like this, but this is Benton's Gothic. I was not able to find a really popular modern version. So there are such things. David Bigelow did a design for Font Bureau, which does that, but it's another genre of sans serif. And then we see the so-called geometrics or constructives. Above is Eric Gill's humanist style. So, and below that is Hermann Zapf's Optima of 1958, and Gill's was 1928. So they're very different interpretations, but they're both based in a way on the very older Aldine Garamond model of types that still have a visible, a detectable relationship to the handwriting of the humanists. I think there's a wonderful thesis by Ricardo Oloco in which he tracks down what he thinks was the calligraphic precursor to Jensen's Roman. Then to a variation of this, more modern variations, the upper one is Hans Ed Meyer's Syntax, Antiqua, and below that, Calibri, which Microsoft put as the default font for Office. They both have the double looped lowercase g, the open gap of the A, and somewhat classical Roman capitals. Going back to the grotesques, in the 1920s, the grotesques were eclipsed by the geometrics. And above, you see the famous Futura, which was blessed with a wonderful name, the future, as well as a wonderful advertising slogan, the type of our time. And this was how it was marketed. And essentially, then it took over for almost 30 years until people were bored with it. But it really swamped the grotesques. And it swamped, to a large degree, the humanist style of Gill, except in England, where they remained loyal to Gill. They were not going to adopt these continental disgraces that would, and I think it's Beatrice, it's somebody else, but points out that by the 1950s, the especially the French, or at least a French-speaking person, said, well, the problem with Futura and such things is they're froid, mécanique et démodé. They're cold and mechanical and out of fashion. So there are many other variants, but these were the ones that seem to be recurring again and again. But instead of them coalescing toward a certain endpoint, almost teleologically heading toward something that we didn't know it existed, instead they rise and fall in popularity, and periodically they're refined and made more sophisticated with a feeling of the new time, of our times. One I particularly like are the archaics. They don't really have this form, but this is above is an archaic by Hans Edmeyer, who did syntax. In the middle is Skia, which Matthew Carter did for Apple. And at the bottom is Nami, which Adrian Frutiger also did. And the same, they're looking for something terrific about those ancient inscriptions that they can capture and type. They almost never sell well, but they are monuments to something wonderful. And by the way, please look at this middle one here, Matthew Carter's Skia. It came out in the 90s, and I briefly consulted for Apple on this and said why they should have So take a look at that middle one, Skia, and around 1994, I saw a science fiction book in Kepler's bookstore in Menlo Park, and it was all set in Skia. And I was thinking, should I buy this or not? Do I know this author? Is the novel good? And I'm thinking, yeah, I think I'll get it. And then my friend I was with said, well, we got to go. So I left, and I thought, well, I'll come back. I never went back, and I've never found that book again. But if you find it, let me know. I'll get it. Now, the other thing about sans serif is, just as it was in Paris when the humanist Garamons and Grandjeans were popular, sans serif is today's font. And I would call it then sans serif hegemony. That is, that it has captured our modern imagination. And when you try to hear why they like it, among other things, they say, it's clean. I think this is a reflection of American Puritanism. The type has to be clean. And the types of the early 90s where they were, suddenly they were not clean. And one of my favorites was Bleeding Cowboys, but there were many others. But those are now démodé. But in the New York Times, I just read about a failure of a Silicon Valley firm. And the critic and writer said, well, now how could it have failed? It was slickly sans serif like all the others. And if you want to believe this, you have to understand the connotation. Some people call it the semantic differential, which is a great term if you're an academic. But all you have to do is look and so here's alphabet, sans serif. There's meta, sans serif. And you think, well, sure, that's fine, no problem. But what if it weren't sans serif? How about, here we go. Yeah, so there's alphabet, meta. Doesn't that give you a good feeling? The people are trying to protest these companies as being monopolies and stuff. But what if it was in, this is Chris Holmes's type Fiorella, and the other is Lucida handwriting. Well, don't you have a happy feeling to look at them? Google's on our side. How could anybody so loving and sweet and graceful have anything bad to think about capturing our information and making use of it? So when we try to understand the evolution of sans serif in particular, why has it captured so much of our modern typographic landscape and imagination, I isolated 4 possible drivers of this evolution. One is fashion. And clearly that seems to be powerful throughout the history of types that become popular. Next is function. Do they do a job, sort of? And in fact, when the German foundries adopted grotesque, there was a function. It was for things that they didn't want to set in Fraktur, and for small sizes, or jobbing type as they're called in English, where you just need some type to do an advertisement, a letterhead, a small thing. There's economics. This is also important because if the publishing context changes. Maybe some types are better than others. Newspaper types have their own evolution. They're serifed, but they have an evolution to save paper, and they really want to save paper because it's like 75 to 80% of the running cost of producing a newspaper. So they're like the legibility group of Linotype and others, where big X sites get big. And oddly enough, they converge on what's called the critical print size, at which point, if the sizes get too small, reading slows down precipitously. And the newspapers, without ever having done the psychological experimentation, have already converged, but not exactly at the critical point, about 10% bigger, because they know that newspaper readers are of all kinds. Not everybody has corrective lenses and so on. So they are there. And there's other technology. I was a strong believer that technology needs to be addressed by type design. In the early days of low resolutions and low resolution printers and screens, it seemed obvious that we had to design types to make up for the deficiencies of the technology. And others warned me that that would be a bad idea because technology would change. But we did it anyway, because we also wanted to make cell types. It's a commercial field, and if people are buying things for a certain environment, a certain screen size, a certain resolution, you wind up designing for those things. And this has been true for the last 40 years. In downtown Palo Alto, I happened to pass this sign. The future started yesterday, and we're already late. Even when we started doing digital type at Stanford, there were, as Ferdinand Ulrich has pointed out, there were other efforts here and there. So it was distributed, and we were maybe late, but maybe not. What's happened now? The other thing, other than the effect of digital typography on design, there is the effect on distribution and the effect on volumes of production. So we've, in that Scientific American article I showed yesterday briefly, I'm glad that Don Day and I didn't give a prediction of how much digital type would change things. And we say in the article that at the time we wrote it, 1982, 83, every digital type that came out from someplace was a copy of an old photo type or a metal type. It was all imitation. That's what customers wanted. They didn't want a new technology if they couldn't produce their Baskerville or their Garamond or their Helvetica that they were already using. So we said, but once this technology was adopted widely and artists could get to it and work with it and understand it, then we would see a creative phase. No one asked me how much that would happen. How fast will we get creative? How many? And I would have said, oh, maybe over the next 40 years, there might be 2 or 3 doublings. There were about 1,000 types that anybody used very much, including display types. So there was only a few hundred text types. If you go through the old Monotype and Linotype catalogs, you see these. But I thought, okay, maybe a doubling from 1,000 to 2,000, a doubling from 2,000 to 4,000, probably not to 8,000. I mean, who could even recognize 8,000 fonts? Today, my font says that they have 270,000 fonts and counting. So really, depending on how you look at it, this is a doubling every 4 years. So it's almost a factor of, it's 1,000. And if we look over here at Google Fonts, they only have, they distributed 78 trillion fonts to computers across the world. That shows how easy it is to just, you don't have to have an ox cart as you did in the Renaissance, full of lead, and traipsing across Europe. No, these things come faster than you can spit. And they only have 1,600 but families, and every one of these families has usually several variants. So we see this vast number of fonts here. What can we do? So is it fashion? Is there functionality? The problem with functionality is that a primary source of functionality or factor is legibility. You want to know, are these fonts legible? Problem is with 270,000 fonts, there's more. In an entire century of legibility studies, I don't think there was more than 100 fonts ever studied. So what's happening is that we have no way of evaluating the effects of these fonts on either human minds or human brains or human vision. So what we're undergoing is a vast, uncontrolled experiment that companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft, this is not a criticism, Probably, but it's a good thing that Congress has not gotten their eye on this, so they could go after these companies for another reason. Just like the English savants worried about Baskerville, they should be worried about the uncontrolled experiment of sans serifs on the effects of billions of hapless readers. And here, I'm looking at Latin types. I should apologize for that at a conference on non-Latin, but nevertheless, think of it this way. We're doing these experiments on Latin types for Latin readers, and all of the mistakes and errors are accumulating in Latin, and these are lessons that could be learned from every other non-Latin type. Not exactly, but if you're doing a Greek, it turns out Greek is read differently. A nice experiment by Kevin Larson at Microsoft with Matthew Carter shows that you have slightly different factors, which I think Kevin called imperfect tweaking. And so you try to adjust X heights and descender lengths and ascender lengths and widths to try to find an optimum that might give you 5% greater legibility by some measure. But if AI is now going to help us make types, can it help us evaluate types? Can it help? Or can it hurt? So about 5 years ago, Sampo Kassala, who was an old associate of mine, I just saying that, at MyFonts, developed a deep learning, you might say AI, looking at the 133,000 fonts that MyFonts had then, half of what they have now. And he had a team of programmers, and they worked on training the neural networks to recognize these differences and similarities between types. And this is a cloud that he shows. Each of these nodes is a little grouping of types. There's thousands of categories. In A-type I and typography, we recognize maybe 10, 20 different distinctions. And here's maybe 20,000 different distinctions. So the AI is onto something, but it's only halfway there. If you trained it a little more on a few more types, AI could be designing types. It would be font GPT, not chat GPT. So another problem is that after more than a century of legibility research, we still don't know what it is we need to train artificial intelligence to actually recognize and evaluate. I'm sure some of it would be unbelievably ridiculous, but something might be good. We don't know. I want to just mention a few legibility researchers. Here we see the woman on the right is Barbara Rothlein. She worked with American type founders in 1910, 1911 on a legibility study in America. It was the first really excellent legibility study that looked at variations of typefaces, not just size. Often people had figured out the problems with type size for legibility, but not variations. She worked with Morris Fuller Benton, the chief designer of American type founders, and she wrote a thesis for Clark University, her master's thesis, and today it's sort of looked not down upon, it's kind of ignored because the criteria that Morris Fuller Benton used and that she adopted possibly from her own teachers was acuity. So she gave nonsense words and then asked, and she had a wonderful little apparatus that she could move the types farther away and see if people could read the letters. So it's a wonderful story. She discovered, for example, that X height and width influence legibility. We know this if you're a designer, but not everybody knew it. In fact, the knowledge was poorly distributed. Earlier, Javal in France thought that width was most important. Others had thought that X height was important, but Rothlein discovered both. And her thesis was published in the American Journal of Psychology. And then there was a hurdle. In 1911, 1912, there were essentially, maybe two professorships available to women in psychology in the United States, maybe only one. And so she did not pursue this. It was a tremendous loss, I think, to the field. If she had kept on going, we might have learned much more. She married her biology professor at Clark College and worked his way. She worked for him to get his medical degree, and they moved to Porterville, California, where he set up a medical practice. And I know this from Lori Freer, my colleague at Rochester Institute of Technology, who's looked into this. And Barbara Rothlein never wrote another paper on typography. It's a tremendous loss. Today, there's many women writing PhDs in the psychology of typefaces and psychological experiments. Sophie Bayer in Denmark and others. So it was a loss 100 years ago, overlooked. Just to show a little bit of misogyny, this is Miles Tinker. He also wrote a thesis at Clark University 10 years later than Barbara Rothlein, and he got accepted into Stanford, where he did his PhD thesis on the legibility of mathematical equations. And then he went to work at University of Minnesota, where he did like 30 years of experiments. And in those days, it was easy in a way. He had undergraduates in psychology, and as a part of their psychological course, he could have printed up some examples of type of various sizes, various styles, various layouts, flush left, flush right, more leading, less leading, and have them read these, and then they would time the reading of it. And he wrote his book, many papers throughout the 20s and 30s, and his book was published in the 1960s on the legibility of printing types. It feels today like that was a wonderful empirical studies lacking theory. He found out all these facts, but there was no guiding light in psychology in those days beyond behaviorism about how we would interpret this. In the 1980s, others began to research this. Gordon Legg at University of Minnesota, Dennis Pelly at New York University, and others were doing eye tracking experiments, whereas psychophysical experiments. So we have a much better grasp on what to look for than we did then. But Miles Tinker did this stuff. But the fact that we have 270,000 fonts, some people think it's 500,000 or 750,000, showing you we can't even count how many fonts there are out there, because we can't always distinguish between a design and a physical, an electronic font. There might be millions of rip-offs and copies and botches of these things. But anyway, there's a lot. So a recent experiment called Individuated Reading Experience. It's got several authors, and it's a 50-page paper. They did a mass experiment with like 370 people, and they reading things on the internet. They didn't have to bring them into the laboratory. And a change that has happened since Barbara Rothlein and Miles Tinker and Willem Ovink in Holland is that it's today cheaper to make a font than it is to conduct a psychology experiment on them. In the old days, you couldn't have asked Linotype or American Type Founders to make you a new font. It was far cheaper to just use what they had, and you could get students for free to pass their psychology course. But now you have to pay subjects, and you have to stuff. It's much cheaper to make a new font. And I did this with Bob Morris, an old colleague, where I made a serif. Chris Holmes and I actually did the work. I made a sans serif and a serif font. And they did a study, and it turned out that there was, at moderate sizes, there was no significant difference in reading speed between serif and sans serif. And I made sure that were all the same widths, the stems were the same, the X height were the same, the capitals were the same height, and everything, all the parameters were the same, except some letters had serifs and some didn't. It turns out, though, that at small sizes, there was a trade-off in favor of sans serif. And it was not entirely understandable. But it only happens at small sizes. But they're still small enough that when you get up in the middle of the night to take an aspirin or something, and you're looking at the label on your aspirin bottle, you can't read it. So they're always in sans serif. Nobody has that in Bembo. Bodoni. They're in a sans serif. They're more like Morris Fuller Benton's narrow Gothics. And I think that I'm not sure, I should look this up. Are there regulations that say type height, but they forget to say type width? And so the patent medicine makers experiment with this. Who wants to get up in the dark and you can't find your glasses, and now you want to take a pill, and which pill are you going to take? And the older you get, this becomes a more serious problem. So this study, I think, is marvelous because they really tackled the problem. I don't quite agree with their results. And one of the things that, out of a hidebound and conservative view, it doesn't actually tell me which typefaces are the most legible. It tells us that if somebody has pre-training, they will find some faces more legible. But if it turns out, even in their own experiments, if you look at a second test they've done, sometimes it's the other way around. They thought they compared Noto sans with Times New Roman. And so at first you think, oh, Times New Roman is going to win. No, Noto sans is going to win. That's serif. That's sans serif. But sometimes the same person will, at one point in an experiment, find Noto sans more legible. And when the test is run again, she or he finds Times New Roman more legible. So the results aren't, to somebody who's a rigid thinker like I am, I'm not happy with this sort of statistical distribution other than minor typographic quibbles. Nevertheless, we need not one of these, we need hundreds of them if we really want to have a view of what the vast experiment on our eyeballs is happening. And they're not our eyeballs, they're part of our brain. Another problem, everybody has looked at the mode metaphor that we have that sort of won out, the outline font metaphor. I called it glyptal because they were from glyphs. Nobody liked that term, so we've stuck with outline now. But here's one with live fonts. They use color, shape, and animation instead of regular Latin letters. It requires a good deal of learning to read this, but people can actually read it. And one of the student experiments I did, or assignments at Stanford, was to figure out what color were the vowels. So they had to figure out, and then they had to compose a poem using the vowels in color. And so when you have something like, I met a traveler from an antique land who said two legless stand in the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies who frown and wrinkled lip and show that a sneer of cold command. And so if you end each line of the sonnet with a color, you can visibly see it right away. Otherwise, you have to read it and use your oral sensitivity to get through it. And one of my students was an Italian woman from Italy. They were just at Stanford for a year. She did a wonderful sonnet by Petrarch. And so, if we thought, I didn't think to ask her this, but could she compare a Petrarchan sonnet to a Shakespearean sonnet, and how would the rhyme schemes show up in color? Well, these people have done actual fonts this way. So far, they haven't caught on. But anyway, it's a suggestion that our visual system is so flexible, and it evolved over so many million years, especially in us primates where we have trichromatic vision, that there's many, many other ways. It was just that we had a material problem of how you write. And you wanted something in black and white for higher contrast. You wanted shadows if you're writing cuneiform. You want depressions if you're writing palm leaves with a stylus, and so on. So why are we giving up a huge part of our visual system because of the technical limitations over hundreds or thousands of years? And the other thing is, So in the reverse also, 30 years ago, Chris Holmes and I wrote a paper about a typeface we did for Microsoft, just as a demonstration, called Lucida Sans Unicode. Oddly enough, people are still downloading it and reading it. It's out of date entirely, but nevertheless, we use the word harmonization to say, because we have a Latin-centric type systems that have come this way, then if we want to include Arabic and Hebrew and Cyrillic and Greek and Thai, we need to harmonize those, not because it's the right idea, but because it fits the context and environment we're already in. And it took 23 years, but a wonderful scholar in Germany, Titus Nemeth, wrote a critique of this. And I was so happy to read it, even though it doesn't always agree with us. Chris and I had the same reservations, but we didn't spell them out. I think in only 23 years, somebody has finally read that paper and has something to say about it. I wish they'd say about other things. But here, look at this. This is a friend in Philadelphia, Brian Allen, was walking down the street, and this sign caught his view. And he took a picture of it. And I'm particularly excited about the alphabet on the lower right, which Kamal helpfully told me was a Cambodian font. And I thought, if only this is a cue to Latin type designers to take a look at this and think, That's really something. If only I could capture that as an italic form, say, to some Helvetica or something, it would be, there's a lot of novel ideas that we harmonize Latin to some of the more outre or lovely designs that are being done in other writing systems. Now, I want to speak apart from, how much time do I have?
As much as you want.
Okay. I've spoken about the big ideas, the hegemony of sans serif and the evolution of types, which I don't mean a teleological evolution. We don't know what direction they're going, but we know where they wound up. But now, how did I get into this? I actually studied anthropology as an undergraduate, and I studied printing in art school afterwards. But I was always in love with a set of texts that have been recorded in the state of Oregon, and you see the area. And this is a woman named Victoria Howard. It was actually pronounced Victoire. She was born in the era of Queen Victoria of England on our Indian reservation in Oregon. And she was the granddaughter of a chief, and she married the son of a chief. And by all indications, she was a woman of tremendous intelligence and humor. But here she is. She wove baskets for sale to white tourists and others, and she was not recognized in any particular way, although people knew her lineage on the reservation. It's pronounced, it looks like it's called Grand Ronde, but everybody called it Grand Round in Oregon. So on the Grand Round reservation, Victoria Howard was well known, and she learned old stories and myths from her grandmother and her mother-in-law. Her father died young, and she married John Wachino. And so she had some kind of fabulous memory. And in 1928, an anthropologist named Melville Jacobs, you see him on the right. Oops, that's not there. This is roughly the area in which her language is spoken. It's called today Clackamas Chinook by scholars, but the Indians themselves called it Kiksht. And so I'm going to step away just a moment. I think you can hear me, though. This is the area, but the Chinookan languages were spoken all the way from the coast, all the way up to this thing where it says Wishramwasko. But the dialects changed all along the way. It's like looking at Indo-Iranian or the Latin languages and their evolution. Some of them are mutually unintelligible, and yet we can recognize their affiliations. So a newly minted PhD from Columbia University, a student of Franz Boas, one of the leading early anthropologists of the United States, a German immigrant, he came out to study these languages and cultures. And he was not just languages, but their myths, their stories, their cultural affiliations, their psychology. And he was very, very interested in technology and psychology. And here he is with a disc recorder. This is Victoria Howard later on, and that's Annie Miner Peterson. And he's got his microphone, and he's got a battery from his car there, and he's revving it up, and you can see the circuit board kind of next to him. She dressed up for the occasion, and so did he. This was a formal deal. He was going to do this. Yes?
Is that a wax cylinder? Wax cylinder he's using?
Yeah. Well, he had a wax cylinder. He also did. Actually, this was a wax platter, but he also recorded her Victoria Howard songs on wax cylinders. He had bronze electrotypes made from them, but they were lost in a German university during the World War II. Well, there's many, many things about Victoria Howard and her text that are worthy of note, only in a melancholy recollection. One is that she dictated in a few short years, 2 years really, she died of a heart attack while this was underway. In a few short years, she dictated hundreds and hundreds of stories and pages and myths. It's a phenomenal amount. How she remembered all this is hard for us who are literate to actually grasp. So Jacobs, I saw cartoons in his field notebooks. He was writing to I think it was his fiancée at the time, and it showed him kind of writing and writing and writing. She would dictate a phrase, and then he would write it down in phonetic transcription, and then he would read it back to her, and then she would translate it into English for him. So laboriously every summer he would do this. Then he had to go back and teach in the winter. So he had all these things. She died, but she was so captivating as a person that he spent the next almost 30 years transcribing it all and trying to figure out how to publish this. So the language the myths were marvelous, and it is later believed that they were also poetically transcribed or dictated in a certain way, but not in our Indo-European tradition, but in a method of syntactic complexity. And I'll just give you an idea. Not only is it a fascinating language, but it's extremely dense. And it's phonetically baffling to most of us. The language is called Kiksht. And she called it Kiksht, and later anthropologists working upriver called it Kiksht. Among them, Edward Sapir, one of the great students of Franz Boas, called it Kiksht. And Sapir learned in a short time how to speak it, which was astonishing because no white man had ever accomplished this. There was a jargon, a trade language based on the Chinookan language. It's simplified, but still cool enough. But here's the word for window. It's chlukmit. But in Kiksht, almost everything is a verb. They're really rich on verbs. And nouns are just an afterthought where you truncate some of the stuff off the verb and then you get a noun. So if you break it apart, as Sapir did, that is I is a pronoun or a nominal indicator, in this case masculine. S is a dual. We don't have them in English, but Greeks and some other languages have had them. There's two people involved. But this is the diminutive, because the regular dual is sh, and this is s. And then X, the h, unlike Spanish X for the Native American, Middle American languages, this is a h, more or less like German ach, or this is actually more like ich. It's a reflexive. So the I means that this is a thing. The S is two units, two actors are involved. The ch of the X means it's involving the two of them back and forth. They're reflexive. The E means it's happening a little bit, well, it's happening. I have trouble translating it. It's in it. But in Kiksht, it's the preposition is actually a postposition. So these two little ones, it, in, at this farther away place. The U means you're either close to the speaker or you're farther from the speaker, or you're closer in time or you're farther in time. And then finally, kmit. And the T can be used as a continuative. So you could also say, they two little ones are seeing each other in it. But it only means window. But when Paul the Apostle wrote in the Corinthians, he says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I have known. So this, what is a common reflexive in Kiksht, is a piece of poetic Christian poetry from Paul the Apostle. So these things captivated me as an undergraduate. And here's what the books look like. Melville Jacobs spent years typing on a special IBM typewriter. And you can see, it's typographically rudimentary by professional standards. So, and next, this is what they look like when you blow it up and you want to optical character recognize it. So working with Hans Meyer, I wanted to make a new typeface for this back in the 70s. And Chris Holmes and I then worked on it. And this is a later photograph. But there's Hans Meyer. He was then working at the ETH in Zurich, but he'd previously been for, I think, 25, 30 years a teacher of lettering and so forth. So we made a photo font. This tells you how far back we were. We persuaded Mike Parker at Linotype and then the German Linotype company to allow us to modify Hans Meyer's Syntax Antiqua, which I thought was just perfect for this language. It was handwritten in a way, but it was type. And so here's a comparison. Some of you who read Daniel Berkeley Updike may recall that he said that really the Latin language was the language for which type was invented. And the English was sort of an also-ran. It really wasn't up to it because it had so many other fussy things. So here we see at the top Cicero's oration in Syntax Antiqua. It does look good. Next, you see Daniel Berkeley Updike, and that looks good. And finally, we see Kicht. And Kicht is a very busy texture compared to Latin, and yet it's a kind of a wonderful thing. But it was phototype. So then I began to work in digital type, and my first interest was how can I get these things published? And then I met Donald Knuth and others. I came to Stanford. And continuing the phototype was very difficult, so we took, after we'd done Lucida Sans, we modified it to then make the same kinds of distinctions. And this is a version we worked out with the phonetic characters that Melville Jacobs had used. Well, you can have a font, but then how do you show the dual language? So then we began to think, well, how do you show these two languages in a way that anybody will bother to look at the Kicht? An English reader will read English and say, okay, I got it, seems okay. But if you read the Kicht, it's really dense and marvelous. How could it be done? So we tried alternating stanzas. Then we tried cross-fed stanzas. And then we tried putting them, and you can see how long ago this was. This is a Kindle DX. We put them on a Kindle, and we put them on website things and on an early Apple iPod or the visual iPod. So, but time and again, whether at Stanford or the Rhode Island School of Design where we did some of this work, I was always called away to do something else. And now I think I'm sort of haunted by the ghosts of Victoria Howard and Melville Jacobs, whom I knew, and others, Del Himes, who worked out a way of versifying this. So in the retirement, I'm not worrying so much about the technology. I'm worried about the community. It's gone now. And yet there's still people at Grand Round who remember Victoria Howard or remember the names of her. And it's a culture that was disappeared. At first, they were hit by the diseases of the Western European invaders, and then they were rounded up by military and put in a reservation, and then they were denied most all benefits that the average American citizens had. And so it's astonishing that these marvelous stories have survived long enough that Jacobs managed to put them into print. I was often, and it turns out I'm wrong about this, but I used to think that if the Persian armies had conquered Athens in the invasion of 490 BC, would we have had Aristotle? Would we have had Aeschylus? Would we have had Sophocles? Would we have Euripides? Would we have Pindar? Maybe yes, maybe no. Would Greek have been just a local dialect with the Persian overlords running the show? And again, after Xerxes tried again in 480, and again failed, it was another chance at the kind of wiping out of what became Greek culture. Aeschylus fought at Marathon. His brother was killed, but apparently in Aeschylus's tomb, they didn't mention a thing about his plays. They said he fought at Marathon. And so I feel that it's a kind of the community is worth it, and you see the psychology of this. Let me just make a quick look here. So Melville Jacobs worked on this stuff for 30 years, and not only Kicht, but many other languages. He taught at University of Washington. He gave radio talks. He tried to enlighten American audiences to the cultures that had been either damaged or destroyed in the 19th and early 20th century. And as we say, no good deed goes unpunished. Congress investigated him for being a socialist and threatened him with his loss of his job and disgrace. And so ever afterwards, he felt that it would be improper to give recommendations to his graduate students because the shadow of investigation as a socialist or communist would make his recommendations. I remember, it happened to J. Robert Oppenheimer, as we see in the movie. So he was a great guy, marvelous, always very well dressed and clever and funny. But this is unfortunately a remark he made, a bitter remark really, that so little is left, so much was destroyed, and what a shame it is. It is, he says, the bleak harvest is almost finished. It is maybe 1% of what could have been obtained if the culture-bound, condescending, and racial invaders had had the slightest capacity to perceive merit in the heritage of non-Europeans. So this, I think, is true. Now, while I was diddling away at colleges and teaching, another scholar came along, worked with Del Himes, and worked out how to analyze Victoria Howard's texts. And she has published this wonderful book just recently. There's Victoria Howard, and it's by Catherine Mason. And it's just come out, and she has, it looks like poetry now in her analysis. Whether it really is, it's hard to know. If you're used to rhyme and meter, it's hard to look at the kitsch stuff and think, is this really poetic diction? But when you consider how dense it is and how the phonetics of it work, you can say, oh yeah, there's something going on here. And I think now I will try to read you something. You have to remember, I've only known a few speakers of this language. Even the related dialect is now extinct in terms of people who were born speaking it and raised speaking it. There are grandchildren who are trying to learn it, and I hope doing a good job. There are the texts by Jacobs and by Sapir, but sometimes it's impenetrable. And so I'm going to show you what's in the tote bag. Reading Jacobs' notebooks and actually reading his publications, I came across this few fragmentary remarks, and he loved collecting those. They're not always published in the order he collected them. He liked, because Victoria Howard would tell him some long story about Coyote, who was the hero of this area, a very bad hero, but a hero. But she would say these funny stories. And he said, well, she was a woman of sharp humor, wonderful humor. And he wrote this one down in that typewriter style. And he wrote, I'm unable to penetrate the humor of this remark, but Mrs. Howard thought it was hilarious. So Del Himes and I now go on, tried to figure out what this was. And at this time, we also felt that typography reduces the quality. So Chris wrote this little remark in her kind of a semi-Gothic style, and then interpolated in Chancery cursive, the English translation. So I'll read. You're not supposed to explain humor. In this case, though, I hope you'll bear with me, and I'll try to explain it. It's a story about Coyote. And somebody says, somebody who goes around whistling, they're just like Coyote, whistling, whistling, whistling. This is offensive to be called like Coyote. Yes, somebody would say, oh, they'd ask a Wasco or Wishram speaker, how did this happen? There's topographical places where they say that such and such happened. I say, how did this happen? And somebody told my teacher, David French, well, he did it. And Dave French says, who? And he said, well, George Washington, Jesus Christ, Coyote, that made the world that we have today. So to be called Coyote, though, he was a rapist and a glutton and a trickster and a disgrace in some ways, but his errors and screw-ups and general misbehavior created the modern world that the Indians came to, because before him, they were spirits and powers, but not humans quite the way we have them today. So here we end. So the person who's called to be like Coyote is offended. And he asks, is that really the case? And again, in Kitsht, as it is in other Northwest languages, veracity is important. In some, it's a grammatical category because you're saying, I know this for myself, I saw it with my own eyes. It's what a legal witness would do in a court today. A secondary one is, well, I heard about it. We'd call that hearsay, and it's not admissible in court, but lots of people say, rumors are based on this. A third one is, I dreamed it. So to be asked, is this really true? Somebody now they are obliged to answer. And so the person who accused somebody of whistling like Coyote now has to say whether he saw it himself or heard it himself or did he just hear about it. And there we see one of the marvels of Kitsch. There's 4 tenses, past tenses. One was just a while ago, earlier today. Farther back one is the last couple of weeks or months. Another one is a year or two. And another one is older than anybody alive can actually remember. Although, again, Philip Kaklamet was talking about his boyhood as if I were talking about mine. And he's halfway through something, and he's using the fairly old tense. And he says, oh, I guess I'm old enough I can use the ga prefix tense, which is the remote past. And there were 2 remote pasts. I still don't know why. It's rhetorical in some way. One is ne, and the other is ga, but they both mean remote. So now here is Victoria Howard telling the story of this remark. And the offended party says, and the offender says, and the offended party now has him in the trap. And he says, so that's Kitsch. Yeah. See, sometimes it takes a little while to get the joke. It happens to me too. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom. That's it.